So I'm going to start off by showing everybody the Chinese digital yuan. So here's what it looks like. Helpfully, we made it in Mandarin so that no one could read. But in general, the idea, well, so first of all, I should say that if you're trying to get eCNY, don't. But if you are a foreigner, it's very difficult. There's only 29 pilot cities where it's currently available. And so it's already kind of difficult, but if you somehow make it to the screen and you go to the eCNY in the App Store, and by the way, there have been fake eCNY apps, so just be careful, you will see the first screen. And the first screen basically connects you with, if you have a Chinese banking system. If you're a foreigner, obviously it will ask you for just your phone number. And then if you go through there, great. Then you have your wallet, which has a 2022 renminbi balance right now. And then you will be able to, the first is you kind of swipe up and you can send. And then the second is you swipe down and you can receive. So for people who are like familiar with the digital payments ecosystem, pretty simple stuff, you know, Lightning wallets, similar mechanic. I mean, the basic idea is like you need to abstract away these complicated payment hashes and then be able to seamlessly make payments. I should say, and this will come up more and more in the panel as we go on, that there are not as many merchants that accept eCNY, but the general premise is if you were going to try to pay, they usually have like a sign or something that says that they accept eCNY. So you can go up, request it, and you kind of start this process. But I'll hand it off to Charlene for the eNaira.
Good afternoon, everyone. So what we're seeing in Nigeria, one more.
Oh yeah, my bad. There's also hardware formats. So they have like hardware cards where they have limited amounts. And they also have canes that you can use to transmit eCNY. So just fun fact.
All right, thank you. What we're seeing in Nigeria is very similar to what we're seeing in China. So in October 2001, Nigeria began the very first country in Africa to have a central bank digital currency. And as you heard from Nick, the Nigerian central bank digital currency is a non-interest bearing CBDC. It has parity with the Naira, so it's basically an electronic version of the Naira. But when you look at it, it looks like a typical centralized banking app. You can go to your Apple store, you can go to Google, you download the app. The first thing you do is you create a wallet. There are a couple different types of wallets you can create. An individual wallet, if you have a bank account, you can create, if you're under the age of 18, you create the EDU wallet. And if you are a merchant, you can create a business wallet. So there are a couple of different interesting features that the eNaira allows you to do. You could use the QR code to send and receive payments. They have also upgraded it for you to, if you have a feature phone, you can purchase Bitcoin via SMS texting, and they also have eNaira point of sale units. But there's some things that are very concerning about the eNaira. First and foremost, there's a tiered withdrawal limit system. So basically you have 4 tiers from bronze, silver, gold, and platinum, and you literally get access to your money based on the amount of information you choose to share with the government. So essentially, the Central Bank of Nigeria is policing the wealth of its individual citizens. So on the low end, you have the bronze wallet where you have to share your phone number. On the highest end, if you want to have a decent amount of money in your wallet and you want to withdraw a decent amount of money in your wallet, then you have to share your bank verification number and a utility bill. And this is just one of the very concerning aspects of the eNaira. And you heard from Nick that the eNaira didn't go so well. This central bank digital currency has been around for 3 years, and the rollout was stodgy as best. The technical rollout was clunky. And like you heard earlier, Nigerians didn't want it. It didn't solve for the problems that they were experiencing every day. And we saw that in the adoption rate. And I think when I last checked, less than 1% of the bank accounts in Nigeria were associated with the eNaira. And again, this is a country of 200 million people. So the general sentiment is that it was a relative failure. And we'll learn more about that when we get into the discussion.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. So maybe to step back a little bit, one of the things that I think is really salient here with such a international crowd and something that central bankers often talk about is this is going to fix remittances or cross-border payments. Charlene, starting with you, can you dig in a little bit? Is that what you're seeing at all? Is that a motivation that is realistic? How do you take it?
Yeah, so this is where kind of history and details really matter. So if you look at the data, the Central Bank of Nigeria mentioned that there are three primary reasons to have the eNaira: financial inclusion, the reduction of the informal market, which is the black market, and the cost of remittances. But the data tells a completely different story. The data shows that the eNaira was created to curb the amount of Bitcoin and crypto activity that was happening at that time. So let me take you back to 2020. The year 2020, Nigeria was the third largest Bitcoin market from transaction value in the world. So it was the US, Russia, and Nigeria. So in the year, so that Bitcoin money was actual income that was being taken out of the pockets of the Central Bank of Nigeria. In 2020, in 2019, the remittance volume was 24 billion for the year, but in 2020, it was 17 billion. So there was a significant drop in the value of that. And the eNaira was the answer. So, you know, the eNaira was the government of Nigeria's answer to try to retain and maintain that system of control. And something that's really important to think about, we mentioned that the eNaira started in October 2021. What did they do in February 2021? They put a ban on crypto. So the Central Bank of Nigeria banned crypto use through banks to curb this transaction volume of Bitcoin, and then quickly followed up with the creation of the central bank digital currency.
Roger, are you seeing similar things in China? Is this a similar motivation, this cross-border element at all coming through, or is it the case that that's not at all what they're looking at?
Well, I want to say two things about this. The first is that China is trying to export its standards across the world. And you see this with constructions like the M Bridge, which are trying to bridge CBDCs between the Bank of International Settlements, between the United Arab Emirates Central Bank, Hong Kong Central Bank, Thailand Central Bank, and China's. So when we're talking about cross-border remittances, I want to say that I think China's play is to try to make a standard for the entire world on how the government could control digital money. And secondly, not necessarily as much like cross-border flows. As I mentioned, you know, for example, it's unlikely that people are going to use the ECNY in other countries than China. I think you see a lot of political tension around that. It's possible some friendly nations maybe, but by and large, I don't think it's going to be adopted. But having said that, I know the Chinese Party state is also making attempts to help foreigners. For example, there have been English guides on how to use ECNY being released. So that's been a big thing where there's been visa-free travel, as well as English guides for foreigners to onboard onto the ECNY. So just as we're talking about cross-border.
For anyone who hasn't had the pleasure of seeing the English guide to the digital yuan, I also have to add it has a almost dystopian feel because there's this very cute anime-esque, I think it's a rabbit or a bear that's
yeah, they like to do that. It's like the Winter Olympics.
Yeah. I think one interesting kind of difference between these two countries is what the citizens are doing on the ground. And we're talking about central banks and governments at large have limited resources. That's time, energy, and money that they could be doing much better things. I'm a little doubtful at how much better, but they could be doing better things than this. Charlene, is this really addressing problems that Nigerians are facing on the ground? Is this a good use of resources when they're so limited in this time?
Not at all. I mean, and I think that you know this because of the adoption, but you know, let's talk really quickly about the problems that we see in Nigeria. You heard it a little bit when Nick was talking. There are layers to the Nigeria situation. Kind of at the very top layer, and you heard it from Farida earlier, money is hard to move in Africa. It's particularly hard to move in Nigeria. Nigeria has a fragmented banking and payment system, which means money is slow and hard to move. So that's layer one. Layer two is that the economic environment in Nigeria, in particular this year, has been very difficult. So they're dealing with hyperinflation. The devaluation of the Naira this year in particular has been significant, and that just makes everyday living tough. Tough to buy groceries, tough to pay for school fees, tough to live. But I think the foundational problem that we see is a general lack of trust in the government and a lack of trust in the central bank. You heard earlier that Nick talked about the bank shortage that we had in Nigeria, the bank note shortage. That bank note shortage was, I think, kind of the last straw. You expect that if the central bank is making a routine change in their policy, then they would have projected that they'd have the appropriate number of notes in the banking system. But that caused such a chaotic economic situation. I think your average everyday Nigerian decided, you know what, I need to solve this problem myself. I need to take matters in my own hand. And they're looking to Bitcoin to do it and not the eNaira.
Roger, I'm really interested in this as I was kind of teeing up, because China, though, has such a huge mobile payments adoption. It, in many ways, has led on that. People were kind of ahead of the curve in figuring out how to integrate, how to get to tap, to scan, and the like. And so it really makes one wonder, what is the problem for Chinese citizens that a CBDC would solve? Is there anything there that's really going to help them that you see?
Well, so here's the thing. I think that you've asked central banks to effectively become tech companies. And in China, this is where you're actually seeing massive failure, because China, as Nick has mentioned, has WeChat Pay and Alipay, and these are already really large payment services. Even Chinese government employees will take their ECNY and transfer it onto other platforms, because why would you be on a third platform that's accepted by less merchants? So you're seeing the struggle where the problem is, and I think this is the thing when I talk about the digital yuan, in the short term, the Chinese Communist Party derives its legitimacy from its purported competence to rule the Chinese people and deliver economic and technological progress. But if you look at the central bank digital currency, the way they've structured it, it's been a complete failure. In 2022, they processed about $8.2 billion in payments. I believe the approximate number for Bitcoin was about 8.4 trillion, right? So you're talking about this massive lack of scale, and it's because even though they own all the levers of state power, they can't get people to adopt it. There have been people who have been asked about this, and they're like, well, why do I have a third app? And that's pretty much a consistent answer. Even in all the pilot cities, they were given airdrops of free money to use it. They don't really use it anymore. The problem, I think, is that governments, and as we've seen in Nigeria as well, they will take their lack of competence and reinforce that or try to make up for that through force. And I think more and more you'll see that across the world, and you will especially see that in China, and you have seen that in Nigeria.
Can I add? And I know we didn't talk about the kind of merchant problem that we have in Nigeria. Very much like in China, merchants are like, we don't want it. We don't want to use it. It's clunky. The learning curve is difficult. I talked about some really interesting features that the eNaira has, but they didn't get those features on day one. They were rolled out over the course of 3 years after the app had made a number of different mistakes. And so if the merchants aren't there, then the consumers aren't there. And like you heard with Nick earlier, the government of Nigeria, they tried all kinds of campaigns to try to incentivize people to use it, giving away free money, giving free taxi rides, reduced taxi rides if you use it. But the people of Nigeria just said no, because it just didn't make sense from an everyday user standpoint.
This is so amazing to have you both say this. We did not plan this, but I couldn't ask for a better tee-up, because a running theme has been government incompetency, government inefficiency. But many of us are here because of concerns about human rights and civil liberties specifically. And exactly as we were just saying, a lot of this comes down to its inefficiency at first, and then comes force. And if you had a shop on the ground that opened up and had 0.5% in sales, they would close down. When you have a government open something up, you have that threat of force looming in the shadows. And so I'm wondering from both of you, and Roger, maybe we'll start with you. What specific concerns do you have about CBDCs and their potential impact on human rights and civil liberties in China, and also this panel's CBDCs in Nigeria, China, and beyond? So please, both of you, feel free to stretch beyond those borders as well.
Yeah, I want to bring some references from some of the talks that you've heard. We saw Jimmy Lai and his son, Sebastian, and one of the first things they did in the Hong Kong protests was they froze the bank accounts of people who participated or were leaders in the pro-democracy camp. So there's obviously a lot of concern. The more control you give a government, the more they will exert that control. And we've certainly seen that in China. I'm just going to bring up also trying to bridge the activism side. We're in Oslo. Yesterday was the anniversary of Tiananmen Square. And one of our most famous Chinese Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Liu Xiaobo, once said, if I had an iron rice bowl, like with the communists back in the day, I probably would not be able to protest. Meaning, if they controlled my income, then there would be no way that I would be able to dissent. And I think that if a world that permits central banks and governments to control people's income, to be able to expire people's monies, is a world where that control that Liu Xiaobo feared would happen.
Very good. And so, of course, I agree with everything that Roger had said. And I would also say that your average CBDC exists on a private blockchain. So the eNaira exists on the Hyperledger Fabric blockchain. Private blockchains are completely editable. Private blockchains are not transparent. Private blockchains are just that, private to that central bank, so they have every ability to change the money supply at whim. And when you have authoritarian governments, you typically have massive corruption already. So CBDCs create the environments for additional corruption. It's basically a tech-enabled breach on privacy. CBDCs are massive surveillance tools, and they're problematic for the world.
Well, maybe shifting gears slightly to a momentary note of positivity. You both have books that are about to hit the shelves. So Roger, you have Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? And Charlene, you have The Bitcoin Leap. Starting with you, Charlene, I'm very curious, both what do you see in Nigeria as far as Bitcoin development goes, as far as people taking that leap? And you touched on this a little bit, but could you dig in more to how governments that are launching CBDCs, how are they treating Bitcoin?
So my upcoming book, The Bitcoin Leap, How Bitcoin is Transforming Africa, is a celebration of Africa's Bitcoin story. I've taken the past year to really talk to a number of different African entrepreneurs that are innovating, solving African problems with African solutions. It will be one of the first Bitcoin books, Bitcoin education books that centers Africa, where you really can get an understanding of how this monetary technology is changing the continent. And with regards to your question, Nick, governments are afraid of Bitcoin, but because it threatens the existing power structure, the existing power system of control, and the intentional dysfunction that we continue to see in Africa. Bitcoin breaks those chains, and I believe will finally allow Africa and other countries to take their place on the global stage and finally participate in the global economy.
Roger, what do you see in China as far as that same relationship goes? I think many people here are probably already a little familiar, but can you dig into how that's going?
Well, I think that if you're, I wrote a whole book on the topic, as you alluded to, but I think that people in China, one of the most meaningful forms of dissent right now, because China has capital controls that don't permit you to exit the country. So you have a $50,000 USD limit per person. And a lot of people in China have bought Bitcoin, not necessarily because they are human rights activists or they believe in dissent, but going back to what I said before, the Chinese Communist Party derives its legitimacy from its controlled economic system. Probably one of the most meaningful things you can do to express dissent in that context is to shift your money into places outside of the Chinese state's control. And I believe Bitcoin to be one of those places, and probably the main place, eventually.
Well, I would like this to be a positive note to end on, but I can see you wanting to do a word of warning as well. But looking broadly, looking at both Nigeria, China, and looking at also at the broader beyond, what are the lessons that you see for human rights activists, for cryptocurrency developers, and even just your normal day-to-day citizens who are just trying to live their lives in peace as we see this world of CBDCs unveil, as the rise of CBDCs continues? What lessons do you see for them, or what warnings do you leave them with?
Sure, I'll start. So I want to just say, and I'll leave on a little bit of a note of positivity, actually, not like a
Thank you.
super, yeah. Look around us right now. We're in universes of activism. We're in universes of technology tools. I just wanted to say, I think tyranny is going borderless. I think central bank digital currencies, digital money, is one of those routes that's going to be so important to surveil on our side, we the people, looking up what our governments are doing. I believe that if activists, if the universe of activism and the universe of technologists here represented combine together, we will be together the most powerful force to dilute and combat tyrants wherever they are.
Hear, hear. Charlene?
I think I will just say the time is now. It's time to get involved. It's time to engage our regulators. It's time to engage our governments. Every entity, it's time to engage our financial systems. Every entity has a role in this fight. Everybody in this room has a role in this fight. And we can't possibly ever do enough to fight dictators and to support the advancement of democracy.
Amen. I'll leave you all with just one last note, and that's one of the most powerful things that you can do is one of the simplest, and just telling a friend to tell a friend about what's going on. The past few days when I was showing people the CBDC tracker, the most common response I got was, I didn't know my country was doing this. I didn't know that this was happening. I didn't know that this was spreading around the globe. And in the mission to fight back, one of the most important things is to make sure people actually know that there's something we need to fight back against. Thank you all, and thank you both.